Eleanor Washington stood alone in the heart of Oakwood Cemetery on that cold November afternoon. The autumn wind cut through her thin coat as her daughter-in-law leaned close and whispered those chilling words into her ear. "This is your place." Before Eleanor could comprehend what was happening, she found herself staring at a freshly prepared grave. Her breath caught in her throat when she read the headstone. Her own name was already carved into the cold granite. Eleanor Marie Washington, born 1952. The death date remained blank, waiting to be filled. Her son Derek stood a few feet away, his face turned toward the dying sun, refusing to meet her eyes. In that moment, Eleanor realized that everything she had believed about her family was about to shatter into a million pieces. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I want to know where you are watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below. If you believe that families should never abandon their own, hit that like button right now. And if you want to see how Eleanor fights back against this unimaginable betrayal, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Now let us go back to the beginning and discover how Eleanor Washington ended up standing before her own grave. Eleanor Washington had spent 72 years building a life that most people would consider humble but honorable. Her small house sat on a quiet street in the historic Black neighborhood of Atlanta, Georgia, a community that had weathered decades of change, struggle, and triumph. The house itself was nothing fancy by modern standards, just a modest two-story structure with a wraparound porch and a garden that Eleanor tended with the same dedication she had given to everything else in her life. But this house represented something far more valuable than its market price could ever suggest. It represented legacy, sacrifice, and love. Franklin Washington, Eleanor's beloved husband, had built this house with his own hands back in 1955. He was a construction worker who had fought for the rights of black builders during some of the most turbulent years in American history. Every brick, every beam, every nail in this house told a story of determination and pride. Franklin had passed away 15 years ago from a heart attack, leaving Eleanor alone but never truly lonely. His presence lingered in every corner of their home, in the photographs that lined the hallways, in the tools still hanging in the garage, in the rocking chair on the porch where he used to sit every evening watching the sun go down. Eleanor had worked as a nurse at Grady Memorial Hospital for 40 years before retiring. She had seen everything during her career, from the segregated wards of her early years to the integrated halls of her later decades. She had held the hands of dying patients, comforted grieving families, and brought new life into the world more times than she could count. Her colleagues had respected her, her patients had loved her, and her community had celebrated her retirement with a party that brought tears to her eyes. Now at 72, Eleanor maintained her independence with fierce determination. She still drove to church every Sunday, still sang in the choir, still volunteered at the community center, and still cooked Sunday dinners for anyone who needed a warm meal and warmer company. The walls of Eleanor's home were covered with memories. There were photographs from the civil rights marches that she and Franklin had participated in during the 1960s. There were certificates and awards from her nursing career, including a commendation from the mayor for her 40 years of service. There were pictures of Derek at every stage of his life, from his first steps to his graduation from Harvard Law School. That photograph, the one of Derek in his cap and gown with Eleanor and Franklin standing proudly on either side of him, held the place of honor above the fireplace. It represented everything they had worked for, every sacrifice they had made, every dream they had dared to dream. Eleanor's health remained remarkably good for a woman her age. Her doctor was always impressed during her annual checkups, noting that her blood pressure was better than most people half her age and her mind was as sharp as ever. She took her medications faithfully, walked 2 miles every morning before breakfast, and kept herself busy with activities that gave her life meaning and purpose. Her pension from the hospital combined with her Social Security and the savings that she and Franklin had accumulated over the years gave her financial security. She was not wealthy by any means, but she was comfortable. She owned her home outright, had no debts, and had even managed to set aside money for her grandchildren's education. The relationship between Eleanor and her son Derek had once been the kind of bond that made other parents envious. Derek had been a mama's boy in the best sense of the term, always calling home from college, always coming back for holidays, always making his parents feel like they were the most important people in his world. But something had changed after he married Patricia 18 years ago. The calls became less frequent. The visits became shorter and more strained. The warmth that had once defined their relationship slowly evaporated, replaced by a polite distance that broke Eleanor's heart even though she never admitted it to anyone. Eleanor often told herself that Derek was simply busy. He was a successful lawyer, after all. He had a wife and 2 children and a career that demanded his attention. She convinced herself that the distance was normal, that all mothers experienced this when their sons grew up and started families of their own. She ignored the subtle signs that something more sinister was at work. She overlooked the way Patricia always seemed to cut their phone conversations short. She pretended not to notice when her birthday cards were returned unopened or when her gifts for the grandchildren were sent back with polite notes explaining that they preferred to choose their own presents. She kept hope alive in her heart because that was what mothers did. They hoped and they prayed and they believed that love would eventually triumph over whatever obstacles stood in its way. But as Eleanor sat alone in her living room night after night, looking at the photographs of happier times, a quiet fear had begun to grow in the corners of her mind. Something was wrong with her family. Something had gone terribly wrong. And she was afraid to discover what it was. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday evening in early November when Derek's name appeared on her phone screen. Eleanor's heart leapt with joy as she answered, her voice bright with the excitement of hearing from her son. Derek sounded strange, his words careful and measured, but Eleanor was too happy to notice. He was inviting her to spend the weekend at their home in Buckhead, the wealthy Atlanta suburb where he and Patricia had built their life. It was the first invitation she had received in over 2 years, and Eleanor accepted without hesitation. She began planning immediately, deciding which outfit to wear, which desserts to bake, which gifts to bring for the grandchildren she barely knew anymore. She had no idea that this invitation would lead her to a grave with her name already carved on the stone. Eleanor spent the entire week preparing for her visit to Derek's home. She wanted everything to be perfect. She selected her best Sunday dress, a deep purple number that Franklin had always said brought out the warmth in her eyes. She spent 2 days baking her famous pecan pie and sweet potato casserole, the dishes that Derek had loved as a child. She wrapped presents for Brandon and Mia, her grandchildren whom she had not seen in person for almost 3 years. The excitement that bubbled up inside her made her feel like a young woman again, full of hope and anticipation for the reunion that she had been praying for. On the morning of the visit, Eleanor called her neighbor Harold Mitchell to ask for a ride. Harold was 75 years old, a retired Army veteran who had lived next door to the Washingtons for over 30 years. He and Franklin had been close friends, spending countless hours on the porch discussing politics, sports, and the state of the world. After Franklin's death, Harold had taken it upon himself to watch over Eleanor, helping with yard work, driving her to appointments, and generally making sure she was never truly alone. He was a good man with a skeptical nature, and he had never hidden his distrust of Patricia. As Harold drove Eleanor toward Buckhead, she chatted happily about her plans for the weekend. She told him about the gifts she had chosen for the grandchildren, about the recipes she had prepared, about how excited she was to finally spend quality time with her son and his family. Harold listened quietly, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his jaw set in a way that Eleanor had learned to recognize over the years. Finally, he spoke, his voice careful but firm. He told Eleanor that she should be careful. He said he did not trust Patricia, had never trusted her, and had a bad feeling about this sudden invitation after so many years of silence. Eleanor waved away his concerns with a gentle laugh. She told him that Patricia was simply different, that she came from a different background and had different ways of expressing herself. She assured him that everything would be fine. But as Harold pulled up to the gates of Derek's estate, even Eleanor felt a flutter of unease in her stomach. The house was enormous, a sprawling mansion that looked like something from a magazine. The grounds were immaculately maintained, with perfectly trimmed hedges and a circular driveway that seemed to go on forever. Eleanor had seen photographs of the house, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of it. This was where her son lived. This was the life he had built. And somehow, it felt as foreign to her as another country. Patricia met them at the door with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She was a beautiful woman, Eleanor had to admit, with perfectly styled blonde hair and clothes that probably cost more than Eleanor's monthly pension. But there was something cold in her gaze, something calculating in the way she assessed Eleanor from head to toe. She greeted Eleanor with a brief nod, no hug, no warmth, nothing that suggested she was welcoming her mother-in-law into her home. She took the dishes that Eleanor had brought and handed them immediately to a housekeeper with instructions to put them away. Eleanor noticed that Patricia did not even look at the food, did not acknowledge the hours of love and labor that had gone into preparing it. The interior of the house confirmed Eleanor's growing sense of displacement. The walls were decorated with expensive artwork and photographs, but not a single image featured Eleanor or Franklin. The family portraits showed only Patricia's side of the family, her parents Victoria and Theodore Ashford, her sisters, her nieces and nephews. There was not a trace of the Washington family history anywhere. No pictures from Derek's childhood. No evidence of his black heritage. It was as if that part of his life had been erased completely, scrubbed away like a stain that someone wanted to forget. Mia appeared briefly in the foyer, a beautiful 16-year-old girl with her father's dark eyes and her mother's dismissive attitude. She glanced at Eleanor, offered a disinterested hello, and returned her attention to her phone without another word. Brandon was nowhere to be seen. Patricia explained that he was at a study group, though something in her voice suggested this was not entirely true. Eleanor handed over the gifts she had brought, but Patricia intercepted them before she could give them to Mia directly. She promised to pass them along later, though Eleanor suspected they would end up in the trash alongside the food she had prepared. Dinner that evening was a formal affair that made Eleanor feel like a stranger in her own family. The dining room could have seated 20 people, but only 4 places were set at one end of the long table. Patricia directed the conversation, asking Eleanor polite but pointed questions about her neighborhood, her health, her daily activities. There was an undertone to her inquiries that Eleanor did not like, a suggestion that she was gathering information rather than genuinely interested in the answers. When Eleanor mentioned that her neighborhood was being revitalized, that property values were increasing and new businesses were opening, she noticed Patricia and Derek exchange a meaningful look that she could not interpret. Derek himself was a shadow of the son Eleanor remembered. He had always been a warm person, quick with a smile and generous with his affection. But the man who sat across from her now seemed hollow, empty, as if someone had scooped out his soul and left only the shell behind. He barely spoke during dinner, offering only monosyllables when Patricia directed questions his way. He never looked directly at Eleanor, keeping his eyes fixed on his plate or the wall or anywhere except his mother's face. When Eleanor tried to engage him in conversation about his work, about his life, about anything at all, Patricia smoothly redirected the discussion before he could respond. After dinner, as Eleanor helped clear the dishes despite Patricia's protests, she found a moment alone with Derek in the kitchen. She reached out to touch his arm, to make that physical connection that had always been so natural between them. But Derek flinched away from her touch as if she had burned him. His eyes finally met hers, and what Eleanor saw there made her heart break into 1,000 pieces. There was shame in those eyes. There was guilt. And there was something else, something that looked terribly like fear. Before Eleanor could ask what was wrong, Patricia appeared in the doorway and suggested that it was time for Eleanor to retire to her room. She would need her rest, Patricia said, because they had something special planned for tomorrow. Eleanor lay awake most of that night, staring at the ceiling of the guest room and trying to understand what had happened to her family. The room was beautifully decorated but cold, lacking any personal touches that might have made a guest feel welcome. There were no family photographs, no flowers, no indication that anyone actually lived in this house. It felt more like a hotel than a home, impersonal and sterile and somehow threatening. Eleanor prayed for guidance. She asked Franklin to watch over her. She told herself that tomorrow would be better, that everything would make sense in the morning. But deep in her heart, she knew that something terrible was waiting for her. She just did not know what it was yet. Eleanor woke before dawn the next morning, her sleep having been fitful and filled with troubled dreams. She dressed carefully, choosing a warm sweater and comfortable shoes, though she had no idea what the day would bring. When she came downstairs, she found the house eerily quiet. The housekeeper was nowhere to be seen. Brandon and Mia had apparently already left for the day. Only Derek and Patricia sat in the breakfast room, speaking in hushed voices that stopped abruptly when Eleanor appeared in the doorway. Patricia greeted her with that same cold smile and offered her a cup of coffee. Eleanor noticed that her hands were trembling slightly as she accepted the cup, though whether from age or from the anxiety that had been building since she arrived, she could not say. She asked about the plans for the day, reminding Patricia that she had mentioned something special. Patricia nodded and exchanged another one of those meaningful looks with Derek. She told Eleanor that they wanted to take her somewhere important, a place that would help clarify some things about the future. She was deliberately vague, deflecting Eleanor's questions with assurances that everything would be explained soon enough. The drive took nearly an hour, and for most of it, no one spoke. Eleanor sat in the back seat of Derek's luxury SUV, watching the city give way to suburbs and the suburbs give way to countryside. She did not recognize the route they were taking. This was not the way to any place she knew, not the way to church or the community center or any of the landmarks that had defined her life in Atlanta. The silence in the car was oppressive, heavy with unspoken words and hidden intentions. Eleanor tried several times to start a conversation, asking about the grandchildren, about Derek's work, about Patricia's charity activities. Each attempt was met with brief, dismissive answers that made it clear her questions were not welcome. As they turned onto a narrow road lined with ancient oak trees, Eleanor felt her stomach drop. She knew where they were going now. The iron gates of Oakwood Cemetery appeared ahead, their ornate scrollwork silhouetted against the gray November sky. Eleanor asked why they were stopping at a cemetery, her voice tight with confusion and the first stirrings of fear. Patricia simply told her to be patient, that everything would be clear soon. The cemetery was old and sprawling, divided into sections that reflected the segregated history of the South. There were areas for the wealthy and areas for the working class, areas for white families and areas for black families, the boundaries blurred now but still visible to those who knew where to look. Derek parked the car near a section that Eleanor did not recognize, a remote corner of the cemetery that seemed newer than the rest. He got out and opened Eleanor's door, helping her out with hands that trembled even more than hers. They walked in silence along a gravel path that wound between rows of headstones. The November wind was bitter, cutting through Eleanor's sweater and chilling her to the bone. Leaves crunched beneath their feet. A crow called out from somewhere in the bare branches above them, its cry echoing across the empty landscape. Eleanor felt as if she were walking toward her own execution, though she still did not understand why. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn around, to run back to the car, to demand that Derek take her home immediately. But something kept her moving forward, some need to understand what was happening to her family, some desperate hope that there was a reasonable explanation for all of this. They stopped in front of a freshly installed headstone. The granite was new and polished, reflecting the weak November sunlight like a dark mirror. Eleanor stared at it for a long moment, her brain refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. Her name was carved into the stone. Eleanor Marie Washington. Her date of birth was correct. The death date was blank, an empty space waiting to be filled. Below her name was a simple inscription, "Beloved Mother." Eleanor's legs gave way beneath her. She would have fallen to the ground if Derek had not caught her arm, steadying her with a grip that felt more like restraint than support. She looked at her son, searching his face for some explanation, some sign that this was a misunderstanding or a terrible joke. But Derek's face was a mask, expressionless and remote, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance as if he could not bear to look at what he had done. It was Patricia who broke the silence. She stepped close to Eleanor, so close that Eleanor could smell her expensive perfume, and she leaned down to whisper in her ear. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, which made her words even more horrifying. She said that this was Eleanor's place. She said that Eleanor had lived long enough. She said that the time had come for Eleanor to accept her fate and stop being a burden on everyone who had been forced to tolerate her existence. The house that Eleanor loved so much, the savings that she had accumulated over a lifetime of hard work, the insurance money from Franklin's death, all of it would soon belong to them. Eleanor could make this easy or she could make it hard, but either way, the result would be the same. Eleanor opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. She turned to Derek, grabbing his arm, shaking him, begging him to explain what was happening. But Derek would not look at her. He stood like a statue, his face turned toward the dying sun, his body rigid with shame or guilt or some emotion that Eleanor could not identify. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. He told her he was sorry. He said he had no choice. He said that Patricia was right, that this was the only way. And then he turned and walked back toward the car, leaving his 72-year-old mother standing alone beside a grave that bore her name. Patricia remained with Eleanor beside the headstone, her posture relaxed and confident, like a predator who knew her prey had nowhere to run. The wind had picked up, sending dead leaves swirling around their feet, but Patricia seemed unaffected by the cold. She watched Eleanor with an expression of mild curiosity, as if observing a bug trapped under a glass. When she spoke again, her voice was calm and measured, the voice of someone explaining a simple business transaction. She told Eleanor that this plan had been in motion for over a year. She explained that Derek had been fired from his law firm 6 months ago but had been too ashamed to tell anyone. The luxurious lifestyle that Eleanor had witnessed, the mansion, the cars, the private schools for the children, all of it was built on credit cards and loans that were rapidly coming due. They were drowning in debt, Patricia said, and they needed money desperately. Eleanor's house, that modest structure in the historic black neighborhood, had become unexpectedly valuable. The area was being revitalized, Patricia explained, with developers eager to buy up properties for new construction. A real estate agent had recently appraised Eleanor's home at over $500,000. Combined with Eleanor's savings, her pension, and the life insurance money from Franklin that Eleanor had never touched, the total value of her estate was close to $700,000. That money, Patricia said, belonged to Derek. It should never have been in the hands of an old woman who would probably just give it away to her church anyway. Eleanor found her voice at last. She demanded to know how they intended to take her money. She was of sound mind, she reminded Patricia. She had rights. She could not simply be stripped of everything she owned because her daughter-in-law decided she wanted it. Patricia laughed at this, a cold and humorless sound that made Eleanor's blood run cold. She explained that they had already begun the process of having Eleanor declared mentally incompetent. A psychiatrist had been paid to evaluate Eleanor based on false information provided by Derek and Patricia. The report was already written, claiming that Eleanor suffered from dementia and was incapable of managing her own affairs. With that report in hand, they would petition the court for guardianship. Once they controlled Eleanor's assets, they would sell the house, liquidate her savings, and dump her in the cheapest nursing home they could find. The grave, Patricia continued, was meant to send a message. It was a reminder to Eleanor of her mortality, a suggestion that her death might be more convenient for everyone involved. Patricia was careful to say that she was not threatening violence, but her meaning was clear. If Eleanor cooperated, if she signed over power of attorney and stopped fighting, they would allow her to live out her remaining years in reasonable comfort. But if she resisted, if she made this difficult, then who knew what might happen? Old women had accidents all the time. They fell downstairs. They forgot to take their medication. They wandered off and got lost in dangerous neighborhoods. It would be a shame if something like that happened to Eleanor. As Patricia spoke, Eleanor began to understand the full scope of the betrayal she was facing. This was not just about money. This was about erasing her from her son's life completely. Patricia revealed that her father, Theodore Ashford, had finally agreed to restore Patricia to his will after 18 years of estrangement. The Ashford family had never accepted Derek, had never approved of their daughter marrying a black man. But Theodore was dying now, and he wanted to make things right before he passed. He had offered Patricia $20 million from his estate, enough to solve all their financial problems and set them up for life. But there was a condition. Theodore demanded that all traces of Derek's black heritage be eliminated from the family. Brandon and Mia would be sent to boarding school in Europe, where they could be educated properly and taught to identify with their white heritage. Derek would take a position in one of Theodore's companies, working behind the scenes where his race would not embarrass the family name. And Eleanor, the last living reminder of Derek's true origins, would be removed from the picture entirely. Eleanor felt as if she were drowning. The world around her had become unreal, a nightmare from which she could not wake. She looked at the headstone with her name on it and wondered if she was already dead, if this was some kind of purgatory where she was being punished for sins she could not remember committing. But the cold wind against her face was real. The pain in her heart was real. And the hatred in Patricia's eyes was very, very real. She turned to look for Derek, to make one final appeal to whatever love might still exist in her son's heart. She found him standing by the car, his back toward her, his shoulders hunched against the wind. She called out his name, putting every ounce of maternal love and desperation into that single word. And for a moment, she thought she saw him hesitate. His head turned slightly, as if he was about to look back at her. But then Patricia called out sharply, telling him that they were leaving, and Derek climbed into the car without another glance in his mother's direction. The engine roared to life. The car began to move down the gravel path. And Eleanor Washington was left standing alone in a cemetery, surrounded by the dead, with nothing but a cold wind and a grave bearing her name for company. The sun was setting by the time Eleanor fully comprehended her situation. She was alone in a cemetery miles from anywhere she knew, with no phone, no wallet, no way to call for help or find her way home. Patricia had taken her purse from the guest room that morning, claiming she would keep it safe during their outing. Eleanor had not thought to question her. Now she understood that it had been part of the plan all along. She sank down onto the cold ground beside the headstone, her body trembling from cold and shock and grief. The granite was smooth and cold against her back, and she found a grim irony in the fact that she was leaning against her own grave marker. Tears streamed down her face as she thought about Franklin, about what he would say if he could see what their son had become. Franklin had always been so proud of Derek, so certain that their boy would carry on their legacy of hard work and integrity. He would have been heartbroken to see this. He might even have died from the shame of it. Eleanor did not know how long she sat there, crying and praying and trying to make sense of the senseless. The cemetery grew darker as the sun disappeared behind the trees. The temperature dropped sharply, and Eleanor began to shiver uncontrollably. She knew she could not stay here all night. She would freeze to death if she did not find shelter. But she did not know which direction to walk, and the idea of wandering through a cemetery in the dark filled her with dread. It was the sound of footsteps that finally broke through her despair. Slow, measured footsteps on the gravel path, growing closer with each passing moment. Eleanor's heart leapt with fear. Had Patricia sent someone back to finish what she had started? Was this the end that the grave had been promising all along? She tried to stand, to run, to hide behind one of the larger monuments, but her legs would not cooperate. She could only sit there, helpless, as the footsteps approached. The figure that emerged from the gathering darkness was not what Eleanor expected. It was a black man in his 60s, dressed in a dark suit with a white clerical collar. He carried a bouquet of flowers in one hand and a small flashlight in the other. When he saw Eleanor on the ground, he stopped short, his face filling with concern. He hurried toward her, asking if she was all right, what she was doing here alone, whether she needed help. Eleanor recognized him. It took her a moment to place his face, but then the memory clicked into place. This was Reverend Samuel Green from Bethel Baptist Church, the congregation that met on the other side of town from her own church. She had seen him at community events over the years, had heard him speak at interfaith gatherings, had even shaken his hand once at a civil rights commemoration. He was a respected figure in Atlanta's black community, known for his powerful sermons and his tireless work on behalf of the poor and marginalized. Reverend Green helped Eleanor to her feet, wrapping his own coat around her shoulders when he saw how badly she was shivering. He explained that he came to this cemetery every week to visit the grave of his wife, who had died 5 years ago. Today he had been running late because of a meeting that had gone long, and he had almost decided to skip his visit entirely. Now he understood that God had delayed him for a reason. He was meant to find Eleanor at this moment, to save her from whatever trouble had brought her here. In the warmth of Reverend Green's car, with the heater running full blast and a cup of coffee from his thermos warming her hands, Eleanor told him everything. She told him about Derek's phone call and the awkward reunion at his house. She told him about the strange drive to the cemetery and the horrible discovery of the grave with her name on it. She told him about Patricia's threats and Theodore Ashford's conditions and Derek's shameful silence. By the time she finished, she was crying again, but these were different tears. These were tears of release, of unburdening, of finally sharing a weight that had been too heavy to carry alone. Reverend Green listened without interruption, his face growing more serious with each revelation. When Eleanor finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, his hands gripped tightly on the steering wheel. Then he turned to her and made a promise. He told her that she was not alone in this fight. He said that the community that had raised her, the community that Franklin had served and protected, would not abandon her now. He was going to take her somewhere safe, and then they were going to figure out how to fight back against the people who had done this to her. Instead of taking Eleanor to her own home, where Derek and Patricia might be waiting, Reverend Green drove her to Harold Mitchell's house. Harold was still awake, pacing his living room and worrying about Eleanor. He had tried calling her cell phone dozens of times, but of course Patricia had it and was not answering. When he saw Eleanor stumble through his front door, supported by Reverend Green, the relief on his face was immediately replaced by fury as he heard what had happened. Within an hour, Harold's small living room was filled with people. Reverend Green had made phone calls, and those people had made more phone calls, and before long a small army had assembled to help Eleanor Washington. There was Dwight Coleman, a civil rights attorney who had spent his career fighting for justice in cases just like this one. There was Raymond Carter, a retired judge who had known Franklin since their days serving together on a community housing board. There were nurses who had worked alongside Eleanor at Grady Memorial, neighbors who had known her for decades, church members who considered her one of their own. The room was crowded and loud and full of righteous anger, and for the first time since she had seen her name on that headstone, Eleanor felt something other than despair. She felt hope. Attorney Coleman took charge of the meeting. He had dealt with cases like this before, unfortunately. Elder abuse was more common than most people realized, and it often came from within families. He explained to Eleanor what they were facing and what they could do about it. The psychiatrist's report was the most immediate threat. If Derek and Patricia submitted it to the court and convinced a judge to grant them guardianship, Eleanor would lose control of everything. But the report could be challenged. Eleanor could demand an independent evaluation by a psychiatrist of her own choosing. She could gather witnesses who would testify to her mental competence. She could fight back through the legal system, and with the right strategy, she could win. But then Harold Mitchell revealed something that changed everything. He had been hesitant to mention it before, not wanting to upset Eleanor with what might be nothing more than gossip. But now, with everything that had happened, he felt she needed to know. The previous week, he had seen Patricia at a coffee shop near downtown Atlanta. She had been sitting at a table with an older white man, a distinguished-looking gentleman with silver hair and an expensive suit. They had been speaking intently, their heads close together, and at one point the man had taken Patricia's hand and held it in a way that seemed far too intimate for a casual acquaintance. Harold had taken a photograph with his phone, thinking that something seemed wrong about the situation. He showed the photograph to the room, asking if anyone recognized the man. Judge Carter's face went pale when he saw the image. He knew that man. Everyone who followed politics in Connecticut knew that man. It was Theodore Ashford, one of the richest and most powerful men on the East Coast. He was also one of the most notorious racists that Judge Carter had ever encountered. Back in the 1980s, Ashford had fought against fair housing legislation in Connecticut. He had funded campaigns against black candidates for public office. He had been implicated in discrimination lawsuits at his companies, though his lawyers had always managed to make the cases disappear. If Theodore Ashford was involved in this scheme, then Eleanor was facing something far more dangerous than a greedy daughter-in-law. She was facing a man who had the money and the connections to destroy anyone who got in his way. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity as Eleanor's supporters mobilized to uncover the full truth behind the conspiracy against her. Attorney Coleman worked around the clock, using his contacts and his investigative skills to piece together the puzzle. What he discovered was even more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Theodore Ashford had been diagnosed with terminal cancer 6 months ago. Doctors had given him less than a year to live. Facing his own mortality, the old man had become obsessed with the idea of setting his affairs in order before he died. This included addressing what he considered the great shame of his life, his daughter Patricia's marriage to a black man. For 18 years, Theodore had refused to acknowledge Derek's existence. He had cut Patricia out of his will, had forbidden her name to be spoken in his presence, had treated her as if she had died the day she walked down the aisle with a man whose skin was darker than his own. But now, with death approaching, Theodore had reconsidered. Not because he had overcome his racism, Attorney Coleman was careful to explain, but because he had found a way to use his money to undo the damage that he believed Patricia's marriage had caused. He had reached out to Patricia with a proposition. He would restore her to his will and leave her a trust fund worth $20 million. In exchange, Patricia would ensure that all evidence of Derek's black heritage was erased from the family. The grandchildren would be educated in Europe, where they would learn to identify exclusively with their white ancestry. Derek would be given a position in one of Theodore's companies, but he would work behind the scenes, invisible to the public eye. And Eleanor Washington, the living embodiment of everything Theodore despised, would be eliminated from the family's life completely. Patricia had accepted the deal without hesitation. She had never truly loved Derek, Attorney Coleman's sources suggested. She had married him to spite her father, to rebel against the strict upbringing that had left her feeling suffocated and controlled. But the rebellion had grown stale over the years, and the lifestyle she craved had become increasingly difficult to maintain. When Derek lost his job at the law firm, the marriage had been pushed to the breaking point. Theodore's offer had come at exactly the right moment, providing a solution to all of Patricia's problems at once. The plan to have Eleanor declared mentally incompetent was Patricia's own invention. She had researched the guardianship laws in Georgia and had found a psychiatrist who was willing to provide a false evaluation in exchange for a generous fee. The doctor's name was Lawrence Fletcher, and he had a history of questionable ethical practices that Attorney Coleman was confident could be used against him. The report he had written about Eleanor was filled with vague generalities and unsubstantiated claims. It would not hold up under scrutiny from a qualified expert, but it might be enough to convince a sympathetic judge to grant temporary guardianship while a full evaluation was conducted. And once Derek and Patricia had control of Eleanor's assets, they could drag out the legal proceedings indefinitely, bleeding her dry of resources until she had nothing left to fight with. The grave in Oakwood Cemetery was perhaps the cruelest element of the plan. Patricia had purchased the plot and installed the headstone as a form of psychological warfare, a way to break Eleanor's spirit and convince her that resistance was futile. She had chosen Oakwood specifically because of its history. The cemetery had once been segregated, with separate sections for black and white residents. The plot she had purchased was in the old black section, as far as possible from the ornate monuments that marked the graves of white families. It was Patricia's way of reminding Eleanor of her place, of asserting the racial hierarchy that Theodore Ashford had spent his life defending. Attorney Coleman managed to make contact with Brandon Washington through social media. The young man was 19 years old and a sophomore at Emory University, studying pre-law with a focus on civil rights. Unlike his younger sister Mia, who seemed to have fully absorbed her mother's values, Brandon had grown up conflicted about his identity. He loved his grandmother and had always resented the way his mother kept them apart. He had heard bits and pieces of the plan over the past few months, enough to know that something terrible was happening, but he had been too afraid to speak up. Patricia had made it clear that any disloyalty would result in his immediate disinheritance and the termination of his college tuition. Brandon was trapped, or so he had believed until Attorney Coleman reached out to him. The meeting took place at the public library, in a quiet corner where they would not be overheard. Eleanor had not wanted to come at first, afraid of what she might hear, but Attorney Coleman had convinced her that she needed to face this. When Brandon walked in and saw his grandmother sitting there, his composure crumbled completely. He fell to his knees beside her chair and wrapped his arms around her, sobbing apologies into her shoulder. He told her that he was sorry, that he had been a coward, that he should have warned her before any of this happened. Eleanor held him and stroked his hair and told him that she forgave him, that she understood the position he had been in, that she loved him no matter what. When Brandon had composed himself, he provided the evidence that would change everything. He had been secretly saving emails and text messages for months, documenting the conspiracy against his grandmother in case he ever found the courage to speak up. The messages painted a damning picture of Patricia and Theodore's alliance. There were discussions about the psychiatrist's fee and the mechanics of the guardianship petition. There were negotiations about the terms of Theodore's trust fund and the conditions that Patricia had to meet. And there were statements so explicitly racist that Attorney Coleman could barely believe they had been committed to writing. In one email, Theodore had written that he wanted to eliminate the contamination from his family line. In another, he had referred to Eleanor as that creature who had polluted his grandchildren's blood. Patricia's responses were equally horrifying. She had promised that the old woman will not be a problem much longer, and had assured her father that Derek was completely under control, a trained dog who knows his place. Attorney Coleman could barely contain his excitement as he reviewed the evidence. This was exactly what they needed to destroy Patricia and Theodore's case. These messages proved not only conspiracy to commit fraud and elder abuse, but also demonstrated the racist motivations behind the scheme. No judge in Georgia would grant guardianship to people who had expressed such blatant contempt for the elderly woman they claimed to want to protect. But there was more. Brandon's younger sister Mia, who had initially appeared indifferent to her grandmother's fate, had experienced a change of heart. Perhaps it was seeing the evidence of her mother's cruelty laid out in black and white. Perhaps it was the realization that if her parents could treat her grandmother this way, they might someday treat her the same. Whatever the reason, Mia had contacted Brandon the previous night with a piece of evidence that none of them had known existed. Using her phone, she had recorded a conversation between her mother and grandfather during Theodore's visit to Atlanta. On the recording, Patricia could be heard discussing the removal of Eleanor in chillingly clinical terms, while Theodore laughed and congratulated her on her thoroughness. The net was closing around Patricia and Theodore, but time was running out. Attorney Coleman received a phone call from a contact at the courthouse with disturbing news. Derek and Patricia had filed an emergency petition for guardianship, claiming that Eleanor had wandered away from their home and was now missing, possibly suffering from a dementia-related episode. A judge had agreed to hear the petition in 72 hours. If Eleanor did not appear in court to defend herself, the guardianship would be granted by default, and she would lose everything. The next 3 days were the most intense of Eleanor's life. She barely slept, barely ate, spending every waking moment preparing for the court hearing that would determine her future. Attorney Coleman worked with his team to organize their evidence and prepare their witnesses. Judge Carter used his connections to ensure that the case would be heard by an honest jurist who could not be bought or intimidated. The community rallied around Eleanor, providing emotional support and practical assistance in equal measure. On the morning of the hearing, Eleanor put on her best dress, the same purple outfit she had worn to Derek's house what felt like a lifetime ago. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw an old woman who had been through more in the past week than most people experienced in a lifetime. But she also saw strength in her eyes, a determination that no amount of cruelty could extinguish. Franklin's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, reminding her that she came from a long line of survivors, people who had endured slavery and segregation and discrimination and had emerged stronger on the other side. She was not going to let Patricia and Theodore defeat her. She was going to fight. The courtroom was packed when Eleanor arrived. On one side sat Derek and Patricia with their expensive lawyers, a team of 3 men in tailored suits who looked like they had never lost a case in their lives. Behind them sat Theodore Ashford, his frail frame barely filling his seat, but his eyes burning with the intensity of a man who was used to getting his way. On the other side sat Eleanor with Attorney Coleman, surrounded by a sea of supporters. Harold Mitchell was there, along with Reverend Green and Judge Carter and dozens of others who had come to show their solidarity. The community that had raised Eleanor, the community that Derek had tried so hard to escape, had turned out in force to protect one of their own. The hearing began with the opposing lawyers presenting their case. They described Eleanor as a confused old woman who needed protection from herself. They cited the psychiatrist's report, with its vague references to memory problems and impaired judgment. They painted a picture of a loving son and daughter-in-law who only wanted to ensure that Eleanor received the care she needed in her declining years. It was a masterful performance, smooth and polished and utterly convincing if you did not know the truth behind it. Then it was Attorney Coleman's turn. He began by calling a series of witnesses who testified to Eleanor's mental competence. There was her doctor, who confirmed that her most recent checkup had shown no signs of cognitive decline. There were her fellow choir members, who described her as sharp, engaged, and fully capable of managing her own affairs. There were neighbors who had known her for decades, who painted a picture of a vibrant woman who was an active and valued member of her community. Each witness was a nail in the coffin of Patricia's lies, building an irrefutable case that Eleanor was exactly who she claimed to be. A healthy 72-year-old woman who was being targeted by her own family for financial gain. But the real fireworks came when Attorney Coleman presented the evidence that Brandon and Mia had provided. The emails between Patricia and Theodore were read aloud in court, their racist language echoing off the walls of the chamber. The audio recording was played for the judge and the assembled spectators, Patricia's cold voice discussing her mother-in-law as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a human being to be respected. The courtroom erupted in murmurs of outrage, and even the judge's stern demeanor could not hide the disgust in his eyes. Patricia tried to object, claiming that the evidence had been obtained illegally, that her children had violated her privacy. But Attorney Coleman was prepared for this. He pointed out that Brandon and Mia had been witnesses to the conspiracy and had every right to document evidence of criminal activity. The judge agreed, allowing the evidence to stand. When it came time for Derek to take the stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Everyone could feel the tension, the weight of what was about to happen. Derek walked to the witness stand like a man approaching his own execution, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the floor. Patricia glared at him from her seat, her expression a mixture of warning and contempt. Theodore Ashford leaned forward, his ancient hands gripping his cane, his eyes boring into Derek with an intensity that seemed almost supernatural. Attorney Coleman began his examination gently, asking Derek about his childhood, his education, his relationship with his parents. Derek answered in monosyllables, his voice barely audible. But when Attorney Coleman asked him directly whether he was ashamed of his heritage, whether he was ashamed of the mother who had sacrificed everything to give him a better life, something broke inside Eleanor Washington. He lifted his head and looked at his mother for the first time since the cemetery. Tears were streaming down his face, and his hands were shaking so badly that he had to grip the railing of the witness stand to steady himself. He began to speak, and what came out was not the calculated testimony of a man following his lawyer's instructions. It was a confession, raw and unfiltered and heartbreaking in its honesty. He admitted everything. He told the court about the pressure Patricia had put on him for years, the constant reminders that his family was not good enough, that his background was an embarrassment, that he needed to distance himself from his roots if he wanted to succeed in her world. He talked about Theodore's offer and the desperation that had made it seem like the only way out. He described the day at the cemetery, the shame he had felt standing there while his wife threatened his mother, the cowardice that had prevented him from speaking up. And he apologized. He apologized to his mother, to his children, to the community he had abandoned, to himself for becoming someone he despised. The courtroom was silent when Derek finished speaking. Even Patricia seemed stunned, her careful composure finally cracking as she realized that her husband had just destroyed everything she had worked for. Theodore Ashford rose from his seat in the gallery, his face twisted with rage. He pointed a trembling finger at Derek and began to shout, calling him ungrateful, calling him a traitor, using words so vile and racist that the judge immediately ordered the bailiffs to remove him from the courtroom. Theodore resisted, screaming obscenities as he was dragged toward the door, his true nature finally revealed for all to see. The aftermath of Theodore's outburst transformed the courtroom into a scene of chaos and revelation. The bailiffs struggled to remove the elderly billionaire, whose frail body seemed to possess unexpected strength when fueled by rage. His screams echoed through the chamber even as the doors closed behind him, leaving everyone in the room stunned by the naked hatred they had witnessed. Patricia sat frozen in her seat, her face a mask of shock and dismay. The carefully constructed facade she had maintained for 18 years had crumbled in a matter of minutes. She looked around the courtroom as if seeing it for the first time, taking in the sea of hostile faces, the sympathetic glances directed at Eleanor, the disgust in the eyes of even her own lawyers. For the first time in her adult life, Patricia Ashford Washington was utterly alone. Derek remained on the witness stand, his confession having emptied him of everything he had been holding inside for so long. He looked at his mother with eyes that held equal parts shame and hope, waiting for some sign of how she would respond to his betrayal. Eleanor sat motionless in her seat, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. The judge cleared his throat and called the room to order. He announced that in light of the evidence presented and the testimony given, he was immediately dismissing the petition for guardianship. He went further, stating that the evidence of conspiracy, fraud, and elder abuse would be referred to the district attorney for possible criminal prosecution. He also announced that he was ordering an investigation into Dr. Lawrence Fletcher, the psychiatrist who had provided the fraudulent evaluation, with a recommendation that his medical license be revoked. The case against Eleanor Washington was not merely dismissed, it was demolished. Patricia's lawyers requested a recess to confer with their client. The judge granted it, and the courtroom began to empty as people stretched their legs and processed what they had witnessed. But Eleanor did not move from her seat. She sat there watching her son, who still stood in the witness box as if waiting for permission to leave. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, a lifetime of memories passed between them. She remembered the day Derek was born, the overwhelming love that had flooded through her when she held him for the first time. She remembered his first steps, his first words, the way he used to climb into her lap and ask her to read him stories. She remembered the pride in Franklin's eyes when Derek announced he had been accepted to Harvard, the tears they had both shed when he walked across that graduation stage. She remembered the cold stranger he had become after marrying Patricia, the years of silence and rejection, the unbearable loneliness of loving a son who seemed determined to pretend she did not exist. And she remembered the cemetery. She remembered the cold granite of the headstone, the blank space where her death date waited to be filled, the terrible moment when she realized that her own child had conspired to erase her from existence. The pain of that memory was almost unbearable. The betrayal went deeper than anything she had ever experienced. How could she forgive that? How could any mother forgive what Derek had done? But as Eleanor sat there, struggling with the war between her wounded heart and her maternal instincts, she thought about Franklin. She could almost hear his voice in her ear, gentle and wise as it had always been. Franklin had believed in redemption. He had spent his life fighting for people who deserved second chances. He had taught Eleanor that forgiveness was not about excusing bad behavior, but about freeing yourself from the prison of anger and resentment. Holding on to hatred, he used to say, was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. The recess ended, and everyone returned to their seats. The judge asked if there was any further business to address. Attorney Coleman stood and announced that his client had a statement she wished to make. Eleanor rose from her seat, her legs steadier than she had expected, and walked to the front of the courtroom. She spoke directly to the judge, but her words were meant for everyone present. She thanked the court for its fair consideration of the evidence. She thanked her community for standing beside her during the most difficult week of her life. She thanked Brandon and Mia for their courage in coming forward with the truth. And then she turned to Derek. She told him that what he had done was unforgivable. She said that he had broken her heart in ways she had not thought possible. She explained that the pain of his betrayal would stay with her for the rest of her life, a wound that might heal but would always leave a scar. But she also told him that she was his mother. She said that she had loved him from the moment she knew he existed, and she would love him until her last breath. That love did not excuse what he had done, but it did leave a door open. If Derek was willing to walk through that door, if he was willing to prove through his actions that he was truly sorry, then perhaps someday they could begin to rebuild what had been broken. Derek broke down completely at her words. He came down from the witness stand and crossed the courtroom to where his mother stood. He fell to his knees before her, sobbing apologies, clutching at her hands as if they were the only things keeping him from drowning. And Eleanor, despite everything, placed her hand on his head and blessed him with the love that only a mother can give. The judge concluded the hearing by ordering Patricia to have no further contact with Eleanor and reminding everyone that criminal charges might still be forthcoming. Patricia was escorted from the courtroom by her lawyers, her head bowed, her designer clothes suddenly looking cheap and tawdry. She did not look at Derek or Eleanor as she left. She had already moved on in her mind, probably calculating her next move, her next scheme, her next victim. Some people, Eleanor realized, were beyond redemption. But that was not her problem anymore. 1 year had passed since the day in the courtroom that changed everything. Eleanor Washington stood in Oakwood Cemetery once again, but this time she was not alone. Derek walked beside her, holding her arm to steady her on the uneven ground. Brandon and Mia followed close behind, their faces solemn but peaceful. They were heading to a grave, but not the one that Patricia had prepared for Eleanor. That headstone had been removed months ago, demolished and discarded like the terrible plan it had represented. Instead, they were visiting the resting place of Franklin Washington, beloved husband and father, whose memory had been the guiding light through the darkest time of their lives. The past year had brought changes that Eleanor could never have anticipated. Patricia had eventually pleaded guilty to charges of conspiracy and elder abuse, receiving a sentence of 2 years probation and 500 hours of community service. It was a light punishment for such serious crimes, but Attorney Coleman had explained that the evidence, while damning, was complicated by family dynamics and the lack of any physical harm to Eleanor. The important thing was that Patricia had been publicly exposed and permanently removed from their lives. Theodore Ashford had not lived to see his daughter's conviction. He died 4 months after the courtroom confrontation, his cancer finally claiming the body that had housed so much hatred for so long. His obituary in the Connecticut newspapers painted him as a titan of industry, a philanthropist, a devoted family man. It made no mention of his racism, his cruelty, or his attempt to destroy the family of his own grandchildren. Eleanor had not attended the funeral, but she had prayed for his soul nonetheless. Even the most wicked among us deserve prayers, Franklin had always said. Derek had filed for divorce shortly after the hearing. The process was long and painful, complicated by fights over property and custody and the emotional wreckage of 18 years of marriage. In the end, Derek walked away with far less money than he had entered the marriage with, but far more peace than he had known in years. He moved into a small apartment near Eleanor's house, close enough to visit her every day but far enough to maintain his independence. He took a job with a nonprofit legal organization that provided free services to elderly victims of abuse and exploitation. It did not pay much, but it allowed him to use his skills for good, to make amends for the harm he had almost caused. Brandon had changed his major to civil rights law, inspired by Attorney Coleman and by the community that had rallied to protect his grandmother. He spent his summers working with organizations that fought discrimination and elder abuse, determined to ensure that what had happened to Eleanor would never happen to anyone else. He visited his grandmother regularly, bringing his friends to meet her, proud of his heritage in a way his mother had tried so hard to prevent. Mia had struggled more than her brother with the aftermath of her parents' divorce. She was younger, more impressionable, and had absorbed more of her mother's values before the truth came out. But slowly, with Eleanor's patient love and guidance, she was learning to see the world differently. She had moved in with Eleanor after the divorce, choosing to live in the modest house in the historic black neighborhood rather than the cold mansion in Buckhead. She was learning to cook Eleanor's recipes, to sing in the church choir, to appreciate the culture and history that her mother had tried to erase. It was a slow process, but Eleanor had faith that Mia would find her way. The family stood before Franklin's headstone now, the late autumn sun filtering through the bare branches above them. Derek placed a bouquet of flowers at the base of the stone, the same kind of flowers he used to bring when he was a child, before Patricia, before everything went wrong. Brandon helped Eleanor lower herself to her knees so she could touch the carved letters of her husband's name. Mia stood back, watching, learning, beginning to understand what family really meant. Eleanor spoke to Franklin in her heart, telling him about everything that had happened since her last visit. She told him about the trial, about Derek's transformation, about the grandchildren who were finally learning to embrace their heritage. She told him that she missed him every day, that she carried his memory in her heart like a sacred flame that could never be extinguished. And she told him that she had won. Despite everything, despite the cruelty and the betrayal and the terrible loneliness of standing beside a grave with her own name on it, she had won. Love had won. Family had won. The legacy that he had worked so hard to build would endure. As they left the cemetery that afternoon, Eleanor paused at the spot where her own headstone had once stood. The plot was empty now, covered with fresh grass as if nothing had ever happened there. But in the corner of the space, someone had placed a small wooden sign. Eleanor bent down to read it, and tears sprang to her eyes. Here, the sign read, a family was broken. Here, a family was healed. Here, love proved stronger than hate. She never found out who had placed the sign there. Perhaps it was Reverend Green or one of the community members who had supported her through her ordeal. Perhaps it was Brandon or Mia, making a private gesture of remembrance. Perhaps it was Derek himself, trying to mark the place where his redemption began. It did not matter. What mattered was the truth of those words, the simple power of love to overcome even the most terrible betrayals. Eleanor Washington walked out of Oakwood Cemetery that day with her family around her. She was 73 years old now, and she knew she did not have unlimited time left. But the time she did have was precious beyond measure. She would spend it surrounded by people who loved her, in a community that valued her, building memories that would outlast any headstone ever carved. Now I want to ask you something. If you were in Eleanor's position, do you think you could have found the strength to forgive Derek? What would you have done when you discovered your own child had conspired against you? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I really want to know what you think about this story and how you would have handled such a heartbreaking situation. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the importance of family and the power of forgiveness, please hit that like button. Your likes help more people discover these stories and remind us all that love can triumph over hate. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel if you have not already. We share stories like this regularly, stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges and finding the courage to overcome them. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. And please, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with a friend who is struggling with family conflict. Share it with a parent who feels underappreciated. Share it with anyone who needs a reminder that they are not alone, that communities can come together to protect their most vulnerable members. Thank you for watching this story of Eleanor Washington, a woman who faced her own grave and emerged stronger than ever. Thank you for being part of this community, for caring about these stories, for believing in the power of love and redemption. May you always be surrounded by people who cherish you. May your family bonds remain strong through every trial. And may you never forget that no matter how dark the night becomes, the dawn is always waiting just beyond the horizon. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.